Lord Chancellor, you referred to the last government being responsible for 800 prisoner releases. I assume you're talking of the cumulative over 14 years. In the year you referred to, 2021, 54 prisoners were released in error, and I'm taking these numbers from your webpage. In 2023-24, it was 115, and that figure doubled to 262 in 24-25. That's a massive increase. It's 5 times more than 21-22. And I'm putting to you that actually it's the very complicated release scheme that your government put in place that is responsible for that spike.
Well, within the figures that you've just...
What you're about to witness is a forensic piece of parliamentary scrutiny. Robbie Gibb pressing DavidLammy with precision in a committee room setting, and doing so entirely on the Foreign Secretary's own terms. Using figures drawn directly from Lammy's submitted data, Gibb methodically exposes how errors in prisoner releases have not merely persisted under the current administration, but have in fact doubled, a statistic that demands serious answers on the question of ministerial oversight. As the pressure mounts, Lammy retreats to familiar ground, pointing to administrative processes and inherited paperwork as the source of the problem, rather than confronting the central issue, that the very scheme now under scrutiny was introduced on his watch. It is a deflection that will satisfy few. This exchange speaks to something far wider than a single policy failure. It goes to the heart of how accountability functions or fails to function within our justice system. Because when a policy goes wrong, responsibility cannot simply be passed down the chain. We'll now go to the footage. If you appreciate rigorous, evidence-based political commentary, please do like and subscribe to stay across the analysis that matters.
Pressured environment. And I should say that it's important to recognise, notwithstanding the errors that have been made, that there were 57,000 releases from our prisons, and these errors account for 0.5%. Now, for all victims, that is worrying, and the system should not be making these errors. But I do want to put those errors into context.
You talked about a paper-based system and how it was very complex. But given that the number of prisoners released by accident doubled between 23-24 and 2024-25, would you accept that your government's early release schemes made the system even more complex and more unmanageable, and that is partially responsible for the number of prisoners released in error?
Well, there were 800 releases in error under the last government.
In which year was that?
There was very serious. The figure was spiking from 2021. As I have said to you...
262 was an all-time high.
Let me, as I have said to you, that there were 4 different release schemes in the last stage of the last government, which added to complexity. And we put in an early release scheme that has also added to complexity. But that scheme was put in to make sure that we still had the prison places to lock up very bad people. And I don't think, Mr. Fox, you're suggesting that we should not have done that, because you, I know, will be someone who wants to see criminals in the right place, and that's in prison. So yes, the truth is that our officers are dealing with a complex paper-based system. That is what we inherited. That is what we are unpicking. And just to remind you that under the last government, Rayon Nubi released in error, Louis Mutasavis released in error, William Fernandez released in error, and William Fernandez, who was released in error in March 2021, went on to commit horrific sexual crimes. That is to say that these errors have been happening under both governments. We need to bear down on it. We need to see that number coming down to historic levels. But I actually don't believe this to be a partisan issue. I believe this to be an issue that is occurring because of complexity, because of paper, and because junior people, both in our courts and in our prisons, are having to make fine assessments in a prison system that actually releases many people every year.
Lord Chancellor, you referred to the last government being responsible for 800 prisoner releases. I assume you're talking of the cumulative over 14 years. In the year you referred to, 2021, 54 prisoners were released in error, and I'm taking these numbers from your webpage. In 2023-24, it was 115, and that figure doubled to 262 in 24-25. That's a massive increase. It's 5 times more than 21-22. And I'm putting to you that actually it's the very complicated release scheme that your government put in place that is responsible for that spike.
Well, within the figures that you've just suggested, there was a spike from just over 50 to 121 under the last government. So
Timed in 23,
Mr. Fox,
24.
you do accept that there was a spike under the last government, and I've said there were 4 prison release schemes that contributed to that. We're in agreement. I've also said that the SDS scheme that we introduced when we came into government, because of an emergency that I think he accepts, so we had to do it, has also led to that complexity. So
the setting requires no embellishment. A packed committee room, a charged atmosphere, and consequences that extend well beyond the chamber walls. DavidLammy enters prepared and composed, yet the questioning that follows exposes the limits of that preparation. Across from him sits Robbie Gibb, unhurried, exacting, and entirely focused on the evidence. Lammy opens by conceding that errors in prisoner releases have occurred, though he frames them as minimal, 57,000 releases processed, with just 0.5% classified as mistakes. Taken in isolation, that figure might appear inconsequential, but in the domain of public safety, no margin of failure is too small to warrant serious scrutiny. Gibb's response is measured and deliberate. Armed with official statistics, he points to a clear and troubling trajectory. Erroneous releases doubled between 2023-24 and 2024-25 and continued rising into 2025. His question is unambiguous. Do the government's early release schemes risk layering additional complexity onto a system already operating under significant strain, and in doing so, eroding the controls that exist to protect the public? Lammy pivots to precedent, invoking the record of the previous administration, a well-worn political manoeuvre. Gibb, however, declines to follow him there. His focus remains fixed on the current data and its direction of travel. The figures, he repeats, describe an upward curve. The conclusion is difficult to avoid. Policy choices made in the present carry measurable and compounding consequences. As the exchange intensifies, Lammy advances the argument that emergency measures were an operational necessity, that overcrowded prisons left the government with limited options, and that prioritising space for high-risk offenders was the responsible course of action. It is not an unreasonable position. But operational necessity does not dissolve the problem of rising administrative failures. References to past cases of wrongful release and subsequent serious reoffending serve as a reminder that behind every statistic lies a tangible human reality and a tangible human risk. A broader pattern begins to emerge from the exchange. When the numbers turn uncomfortable, the defence gravitates towards systemic complexity, inherited dysfunction, and the pressures of crisis management. Yet Gibb's questioning holds its line throughout, introducing further schemes into a framework already showing signs of fracture appears to have deepened the problem rather than addressed it. The figures he lays out are unsparing. 54 erroneous releases were recorded in 2021, 115 by 2023, 24, 262 in 2024-25. This is not statistical noise, it is a sustained and accelerating trend that calls directly for ministerial accountability. Lammy's response that earlier increases occurred under his predecessors does not neutralise the concern. If anything, it reinforces it. The trajectory is moving in the wrong direction, regardless of where it began. By the session's conclusion, Lammy himself acknowledges that the newly introduced scheme added a layer of complexity to an already intricate system. It is a concession quietly made, but it carries considerable weight. parliamentary scrutiny, at its most effective, had done precisely what it exists to do, drawing into the open the tension between urgent policy interventions and the consequences that follow in their wake. This was not a performance. It was the democratic process functioning as intended. One participant brought disciplined, evidence-grounded questions to the table. The other was compelled to defend a policy that the data is placing under increasing pressure. The lesson holds firm in matters of justice and public safety. Percentages do not remain abstract for long. Because when ministers characterise systemic failures as a fraction of a percentage point, the public has every right to ask what that fraction looks like in practice and whether the system governing the release of prisoners is becoming more dependable or considerably less. If you value political analysis that stays with the facts and follows the evidence, subscribe and stay with us. More commentary that cuts through the noise and holds the record to account is on the way.